What's up, guys? Brian Wilson here with Life Unraveled podcast. Going to be bringing you a new episode of History Unraveled. All right. I was procrastinating doing this talk last night, and I'm doing it here at my office studio today. And I'm super excited to be talking to you. I'm going to mention a little more in detail about our topic here in a moment. First, I just wanted to say a little bit about some stuff I got coming up. This talk is going to focus on the Assyrians. And again, I'm going to go in more depth on them, obviously. That's the topic of the talk. But I'm also, I'm pulling from a list of cultures from the ancient world. So I'm kind of doing a series of podcasts. I'm planning on doing a real detailed look into Egypt, Mesopotamia further, and I did a couple of basic just overview videos over Egypt and Mesopotamia, sort of the Fertile Crescent, and I think that anybody listening to this could be helped by listening to those two. To help you kind of understand where we're at. They've got some pictures and maps, and got someone that's been helping me with some editing to add some resources into the video feed if you're watching on YouTube. All right, so planning on an Ancient World series of casts, planning on a series on the Bourbon Dynasty. This is the family that was in power, that was sitting on the French throne at the onset of the French Revolution. I've been working on a big project with that. And also 1968, a list of events. Been talking about that on the podcast for a while. This is kind of how I've noticed, I've been working on this Bourbon Dynasty research, and I've kind of always working on 1968 in the background because it's a favorite topic of mine. But at the same time, you also... I think that there's a lot of value and importance to catching what you're excited about, and catching what I'm doing right now, and I just kind of got distracted and sidetracked by the Assyrians, right? So who is this podcast going to be for? Yeah, history students. You don't have to actually go to a university or a high school necessarily to be a history student, but everybody pretty much takes history courses at some point in their education. If you're a student of mine, past, present, or future, this could definitely be of benefit or an interest to you. Any students taking any upper level or intro level history course in a college, obviously it'll help you. AP history, it'll help you. History nerds, intellectual people, adult people. I mean, this stuff blows my mind. Hopefully it blows yours. And if you're taking any sort of a college course in Western Civilization 1 or anything like that, I think this will be for you. I also think if you like listening to podcasts, this will be for you. Two recommendations and podcasts I really enjoy listening to that go into history would be Danelli Bolelli's History on Fire and Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. So that's a couple places that you could go and look, and I don't think either one of them have done anything over the Assyrians. So without any further ado, I'm going to get into History Unraveled Episode 3, The Assyrians, History's Cruelest People. So I want to, that's my title, right? History's Cruelest People. I want to get into a little explanation about that, right? To this time, you could say that, right? The Mongols are cruel. The Nazis are cruel. Lots of people are cruel. You could even say downright evil if you like quantifying things in those terms. I'm not necessarily calling the Assyrians evil, but they were a very cruel people. They used a lot of psychological warfare, and they were just masters of war. And I'm going to go in detail on all that later on in the podcast. So that's kind of my reasoning for this title, History's Cruelest People. And I hope to go into some detail about the exploits of that and just let the audience be the judge of the Assyrians. I want to talk a little bit about my sources for this topic. Obviously, I've seen a lot of documentaries, and that is not my primary source. I've also read a lot of books. A book I used for my Western Civilization course called Beyond Boundaries. It's not my favorite book in the world, but it does the job, and it has a good narrative. It's a good secondary source kind of narrative. So I was fortunate enough to get to take a professor, which is the greatest professor I've ever had. A lot of people who took this professor said that. He actually knew Elvis. It's not a big deal. His name was Professor David Krieger. Actually only had a master's degree like myself, and I got to take him for Civ 1 when I was an undergraduate in college, and a really special course close to my heart, a seminar in ancient Egypt. And I am drawing a lot from sources I picked up through that course, or from just the narrative and my notes and exposure to the topics I got. We definitely talked about the Assyrians in both those courses when I was in college. To that time, I had no idea who they were, right? And now they are one of the most interesting people that I cover when I teach Civ 1. So I'm going to be drawing from my past experience in learning about these people. And again, I like to point out that I didn't know who they were until I got to college. And there's a lot of speculation about whether or not they even existed for a long time until we got into the archaeological excavations of one of their capital cities of Nineveh in the mid 1800s. Then, when we were able to read cuneiform, that's when we really started being able to interpret the history. Okay. Also, I'll go into a little bit more about this. This is going to be a reoccurring source. I get a lot of sources here from biblical accounts, right? Not just the Bible, also secondary discussions and talks, and scholarly types who have done a lot of research into the biblical context. The Assyrians are mentioned numerous times in the Bible, and it's worth bringing out and cross-examining some of those sources with the other sources we have, okay? One particular guy that I've listened to somewhat of a considerable amount would be a guy named Bruce Gore. He does a lot with timelines and trying to unite biblical context with the actual Assyrian timeline that we have. So I'll be discussing biblical history, and I do have a background growing up in church. I was raised Christian, I guess you could say, slapped the bass in the church band. But then I kind of stopped attending church when I was 19 and went on to get a master's degree in history. My undergraduate's in history and political science, also have a minor and a lot of courses in philosophy. So this is my revision, assimilation, interpretation, and understanding of the numerous sources I've examined concerning the Assyrian people, the Assyrians as an empire, their rise, their decline, their ultimate fall, and the impact and legacy that culture left on the ancient world, especially the history of Mesopotamia. And I really just want to bring out all of the crossroads that the Assyrians have and come to with all of these other ancient cultures which lived in and around Asia and Africa and the Middle East. So I'm going to go into just basically an overview of the Assyrians. They eventually become the largest known ancient empire at their height until that date. Okay, so you talk about some other Mesopotamian cultures, the Sumerians, you talk about the Egyptians, and then pretty much it's the Assyrians, okay? They begin to form around 2500 BC. That's when we're really going to start talking about them. And the Assyrians as a culture lasts for around 1900 years, okay? So here's some scaling on that. The United States, currently just a little over 240 years old. So the Assyrians as a culture lasted almost 8 times longer than the United States has been a thing, right? So they are located in present-day northern Iraq, okay? If you look on the map now, Assyria is not there, right? Syria is, but Assyria is not. Syria was, definitely a culture in the ancient world as well. But the Assyrians, they held on to a small homeland of about 5,000 square miles. And this Assyrian territory, in addition to northern Iraq, also included parts of northwestern Iran, and northeastern Syria, right, and parts of Anatolia as well. First of all, these people lived as peaceful farmers in the upper Tigris River Valley. But this geographic area was a hotbed for chaos and turmoil. The Assyrians were constantly being attacked by these warlike, nomadic hill people who would steal their harvests. This happens in a story told early on in their history. And the survivors emerged as a toughened, aggressive, and expansionistic culture. And eventually they will go on to form the Assyrian Empire, and they kind of become a group of warlike farmers. I remember when I was taking that seminar in ancient Egypt, I believe it may have been Civ 1, but my professor kind of started off talking about them being a group of peaceful farmers in the upper Tigris, and then they were being attacked, and then they became a group of warlike farmers. It's funny joke at the time, maybe if you're not into funny history jokes that aren't that funny, but it's funny to me. Syrian history. It's divided pretty much. Scholars put it into 4 distinct periods, and I'm going to talk about all 4 of the periods. The first one we'll get into after this overview is called the Early Assyrian period. It's a period of a little less than 500 years that lasts 2500 to 2025 BC. This is when the city of Ashur begins to elevate in the region to the status of a city-state. This is also when the Assyrians are subject to the Akkadian rulers and people in power like Sargon of Akkad. The Old Assyrian Empire, it is going to cover from 2025 to 1750. Here you see the emergence of a monarchy and a new capital city. The Middle Assyrian Empire, 1365 to 1020 BC. This occurs at the same time as the pharaoh Akhenaten in Egypt. He's the pharaoh who changed the religion of the Egyptians from polytheism to monotheism. May have just done this as a rebellion against the cult of Amun. I'll talk about them a little bit in this podcast, but this is sort of at the time when the new kingdom in Egypt appears to be flourishing. This Middle Assyrian Empire is also a time when the Assyrians are breaking free from the rule of an obscure ancient group called the Mitanni. Okay. Next up, we have the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This is really when Assyria they're at their height. They're the scariest. And this is 911 through 605 BC. So it's since 2500 that this culture, until 911 BC, that they've evolved to their height. Okay, so this period of their history is seen as the first time that any civilization really obtained the status of empire. Now, we talk about some other empires in world history, like the Egyptian Empire or the Sumerians and the Akkadians. Really, the Akkadians are the first people to conquer all of Mesopotamia. And when they did that, the Assyrians were, in the neighborhood at the time and were affected by that. So let's just make some other sort of overviewing statements. At some point in the history of the Assyrian people, they eventually started winning battles. And they eventually realized that pouring in on any opposition they had and torturing their enemies would make their victories faster and make their impression more effective. Genghis Khan took a very similar approach in how he dealt with people that he was going to war with. So these people become, in this time, by later on in the New Assyrian Empire period, they become known as some of history's cruelest people. And that is just like, kind of why I went with that title again, is just when you research them, cruel, 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 it just keeps coming up, right? So it is kind of a good working title. They're infamously known, among other things. I'll kind of have a segue on psychological warfare and some of their military tactics, but they were infamously known for skinning their enemies alive, among many other atrocities. So eventually, this group of warlike farmers are able to take over, like the Akkadians before them, all of Mesopotamia. And they eventually also develop the most excellent military fighting force that the ancient world has ever seen. Uh, so, some other mentions I've mentioned previously is a source that I was kind of consulting would be the biblical context and the biblical sources of where the Assyrians are mentioned, right? And with that, according to the book of Genesis, I will give you kind of an overview of where I guess you could say their creation myth comes from, right? I'm not saying that it's not true, so don't nobody freak out over there. But according to the Bible, here is where the Assyrians come from. So they have kind of an origin in the Old Testament in the book of Genesis. And according to Genesis chapter 10, the Assyrians come from one of the sons of Noah. Okay, so Noah's who's associated with the biblical flood story. He has 3 sons who settle Mesopotamia after the flood. All right. Now, these 3 sons, one of them is named Shem. Okay, so in the account of Genesis 10, Noah's son Shem has a son named Asher. And Asher is who founded the lands of the Assyrians and the city-state of Ashur after the flood or the deluge, okay? And that's Assur is the name of the city, okay? So the Assyrian Empire and the people as a distinct cultural group are mentioned over 130 times in the Bible. And just kind of likening to some things I've said previously, the prophet Isaiah of Jerusalem said this of the Assyrians: their arrows are sharpened, and all their bows bent. Their horses' hooves are like flint, their chariot wheels like the whirlwind. Their growling is like that of a lion. So, kind of some chilling accounts. Anytime you're hearing somebody else that is going up or has had contact with the Assyrians talking about them, they describe them in kind of this way. And Isaiah is somebody I'll mention a little bit more. He's a prophet in Jerusalem, and I'll kind of make mention of some prophets as we move on down in our discussion here. So I want to make a couple other remarks about some cultural achievements of the Assyrians and sort of some things to do with the dark side of the Assyrians. I remember that being a heading in my notes from when I first was exposed to this group of people, right? So let's talk about some advances that they made. They made a lot of advances in astronomy. Okay, they did this because they worshiped the gods of Mesopotamia. That was the religion, and they believed that if they studied heavenly bodies and their movements, that they could interpret the influence that they would have on the affairs of human beings in their daily life. So this leads to advances in astrology through scientific observation. Assyrian priests had produced relatively accurate circular diagrams called astrolabes that showed positions of constellations, stars, planets, and these were all calculated over the course of a year. By 600 BC, Assyrian astronomers could predict solstices, equinoxes, and lunar eclipses. This is one thing that kind of always stood out to me, and again, these are just some general overviewing topics that again I've pulled from some of my sources. In addition to needlessly torturing their conquered subjects, women are sort of taken advantage of by Assyrian men. So the men in Assyria could beat their wives as long as the stick was no thicker than their wrist. See, okay. That's pretty thick. My wrist is thick. All right. Maybe you have a smaller statured husband and you're lucky. I don't know. Like one of those people who you can put, your your C grip of your hand all the way around the wrist, like I can do with my wife, that's a small wrist. But still, if you do that, you make a circle with your pointy finger and your thumb. I don't want to get hit with a stick that big. Come on now. So, also, here's another thing. No way for a woman to be granted a divorce. And we see divorce is a thing in the ancient world, but there's no way for a woman to have any rights in being granted a divorce. So a man in the Assyrian culture, however, could say, "I divorce thee," 3 times. 3 times. And it's over. All right. I kind of joke about this with my students when I go over this, but imagine you're having you're in a fight with your spouse in your Assyrian household, and you're arguing as spouses do from time to time, and in your arguing, you say, "I divorce thee," just twice though, not 3 times. Just as kind of like a threat. Maybe this is something that went on. All we can do is interpret uh, what it might have been like under these conditions. But I doubt the way that I read when I am reading into the Assyrians and how they treated their women, that any of the women were doing things like arguing back with their husbands. So one cultural and long-lasting legacy that women get from the Assyrians is in Assyrian life, women were forced to cover their faces with a veil when they were in public. It's a long-lasting cultural legacy of the Assyrians that's still in being practiced in 2019. So the Assyrian Empire lasts until 612 BC with the destruction and fall of Nineveh. This is when the Assyrian Empire really ends, but it's by that time that they have sort of achieved status as the most brutal empire in military on the block. Okay, so the Assyrian military, some other things, sort of the dark side of their presence in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So we're talking 911 through 612, right? That's when the Assyrians officially end, and we'll talk about that more in depth. But by the new Assyrian Empire, the army had become the most excellent military in the ancient world. They used iron weapons, which they had imported from the Hittites. Their arrowheads were made of iron. Isaiah had mentioned their arrowheads. Their spearmen, archers, and cavalrymen were equipped with both armor and weapons made of iron. And the Assyrians were the first major power to employ regular cavalry units rather than charioteers as a part of their main strike force. They were known as the cruelest army in the ancient world, and they tortured and skinned their victims oftentimes alive. They had the best chariot corps in the entire ancient world, in addition to well-trained cavalry units. They had a corps of army engineers, which was also the best in the ancient world. They were excellent at taking walled cities by siege, and we'll go into that a little bit more, some different sieges which the Assyrian people engage in. But we do know through depictions and archaeological evidence that the Assyrians had siege equipment, that they employed things like a battering ram, scaling ladders. We know that the battering rams are plated and made with iron, and that they would employ the usage of siege towers with archers at the top. These towers would be built to be level with the height of the enemy walls, and this would be something that the Assyrians would do to help with the siege of a city that they were trying to attack. So new or Neo-Assyrian kings used the Assyrian military to strike fear into the heart of all who opposed their rule. And that's where we get into a little bit of the dark side of the psychological warfare associated with the Assyrians. Okay, so the Assyrians engaged in all manner of atrocities. They decapitated the heads of rulers that they conquered, hung them in trees. They impaled people. They ground up the bones of people that were captured, flayed people alive, put people's eyes out. There were just a lot of really brutal displays of torture by the Assyrians that struck fear into the heart of anybody who would oppose them. And these are the kind of exploits that lead them to being referred to as history's cruelest people. And it lead to Nineveh, their capital at the time that they fall, is being called the Bloody City by people who lived in that time. So now we're going to talk about the early Assyrian period. Okay, this occurs between the years 2500 when they first start appearing on the scene, 2500 BC to 2025 BC. Okay, so before they formed an empire, before they became the Neo-Assyrian Empire, they were somewhat of a regional power, cultural group, Mesopotamia city, state called Ashur. So during the early period, right, Ashur was a city-state and was named after the patron god of the city, Ashur. This is depicted as a war god and a sun god, depending on what time that you're discussing. And as I mentioned in passing previously, that the Assyrians worshipped a lot of, we see syncretism here. They worshipped a lot of the gods that everybody in the area was worshiping. So Ashur is where the word Assyrian comes from. Assyrian. Ashur, Assyrian. They have kind of the same root. So again, don't get that confused with Syria. We're talking about Assyria. There have been previous dynasties that had existed in Mesopotamia. And all of these are definitely worthy of their own individual podcasts, and I plan on really kind of rounding out a lot of this Mesopotamian history to kind of fill in the blanks. I've kind of skipped these as major topics before now, but you know, we had the Sumerians, we had the Akkadians, this is Sargon of Akkad, and then the third dynasty of Ur. Right, so these are all things that are occurring in powerful groups that are gaining prominence in and around Mesopotamia at the time that the Assyrians are also coming to prominence. Okay, so when the city of Ur falls, the central authority in Mesopotamia is lost. Okay, and this is when the Assyrians really start to exert their dominance in the northern part of Mesopotamia. There are several Assyrian kings I'm going to talk about. The first Assyrian kings date to around 2450 BC. There is an Assyrian kings list. I will mention more here in just a moment. Okay, and this kind of brings us into our next period of history, which is the when the Akkadian Empire begins to form. Okay, this is an empire that forms in the region, sort of 2200s, 2230s BC, which would last until 2154 BC. Okay, the Akkadians from Agad or Akkad, Arcadia, are a cultural group that eventually take over all of Mesopotamia. So in doing so, obviously they've taken over the Assyrians. Okay, so this brings us to the old Assyrian Empire period, right, which comes after the Akkadian period. Okay, so the old Assyrian Empire lasts 2000 BC to 1365, right? So after Ur falls, the Assyrians, they kind of go into an intermediate period for around 200 years. This is around 2000 BC. The south is being dominated by Isin and Larsa. These are a couple of city-states, and the north is being dominated by Ashuna and Ashur. So the Assyrians are one of the dominant people in the region that are establishing a presence. They're establishing themselves as an empire and as a trading, is in the trading and commerce sort of activities that are going on there. In 1900, this is when Ashur begins really evolving as a trading empire, right? They start to establish trading ties with the Hittites, okay? So around this same time that Amorite rulers replaced Sumerian rulers. So after the Amorites rise to prominence in the region, the Assyrians start to build up their presence more and more and more from Ashur. We talked about Ashur being added to the Akkadian Empire by Sargon, and also this is a time when we see archaeologically they start to build up the walls of Ashur and focus again heavily on trade and commerce, and establish a lot of trade routes and commercial ties with other groups in the region. So the Assyrians, withstood the Akkadian Empire and Sargon of Akkad and being a part of a group that was all conquered. And then there's a interesting ruler to discuss. His name is Shamshi-Adad, and he rules from 1809 to 1776. Okay. We believe that he's an Amorite prince. So the Amorites are established at Babylon. This is where we get the story of Hammurabi's Code. This is around this same time this is going on, okay? It is thought that Shamshi-Adad might have had family ties in Babylon. The King's List of the Assyrians may have been invented by Shamshi-Adad to establish his reign. So there are 17 kings mentioned in the Assyrian Kings List who live in tents. So it's almost very Genghis Khanish. He establishes himself as ruler of all of those who dwell in felt tents during his reign, which comes much later. But interesting parallel there. So there are over 100 and well over 100 different kings mentioned that ruled from the early period to the new empire. Okay, we know Shamshi-Adad unified several tribes. He seized the city of Ashur and then began using it as a military base and springboard to conquer and unite northern Mesopotamia. We know that even in his time, he was a master of siegecraft and wielded a large and elite, well-trained army of soldiers. So he conquered the city of Nineveh, which would be a future capital for the Assyrians. This is around at this time in the ancient world. And he eventually unified most all of northern Mesopotamia under an Assyrian dynasty. This is really the beginnings of the Assyrian Empire. During his reign, Shamshi-Adad built many temples, and instead of raising taxes, this temple building system was a system of taxation. Right? We see during his reign, he also rebuilt the temple to Ishtar. This is a major Mesopotamian deity that is being worshipped at this time. And we see that Shamshi-Adad is a capable administrator. He allowed territories he conquered to maintain elements of their culture as long as they served as vassals and would come when called upon to help carry out the Assyrian agenda. We think that Shamshi-Adad altered the King's List to make his reign seem more legitimate. Right? When we look at the Assyrian King's List, it goes kind of all the way back to Sargon of Akkad. So we also see him reestablish the Assyrian capital from Ashur to Shubat-Enlil. Right, Enlil is an Akkadian deity, very popular in Mesopotamian culture, and is one of the deities that is heavily associated with the flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh. After the death of Shamshi-Adad, the early Assyrian Empire had a weak line of rulers, and the Amorites are prominent in the region. So in 1770 BC, the Assyrians are conquered by the Amorites, and this is sort of the beginnings of Old Babylon. There's a section in my Civ courses where I get into the Neo-Babylonians, the New Babylonians, and Babylon is definitely a highly revered city in this part of the ancient world at this time and for a long time. So so many topics within just what we discussed so far that could be their own podcast. Akhenaten, the Egyptian New Kingdom, Old Babylon. There's a lot of history inside of just the Assyrians, and that a lot of cultural groups that the Assyrians impacted in a great way, that they're all worthy of their individual podcasts and those cultural groups. And that's sort of my goal with this History Unraveled podcast, to be able to get that information out in a narrative form that makes sense to people. So the Assyrians maintained independence between 1700 and 1500 BC, but then they are conquered by a group called the Mitanni. The Mitanni are a warlike group of people that were located to the east of the Euphrates in a loosely organized state in northern Syria. These people do not show up in the Bible, and they were for a time considered a great power around this time we're discussing. They came into conflict with the Hittites, the Egyptians, and the Assyrians. It's really, we see that after the fall of the Akkadians and then also the Amorites, that the Assyrians really start to exert their dominance in Mesopotamia. And they're kind of rivaled by the Amorites early on in doing so. This brings us next to the Middle Assyrian Empire. This is 1365 to 1208 BC. Okay, I'm going to be discussing a few rulers throughout this time period, as well as kind of some periods of decline and recovery, which lead us into the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which is probably the coolest period of their history to discuss. So their first ruler we're going to discuss is named Ashur-uballit I. Okay, he rules from 1365 to 1330 BC. This is when Assyria becomes more of a region than just a city-state, right? It's when they start to establish more colonies, when they're becoming more warlike. Ashur is prominent during this time. Again, that's their chief deity of that city. And we see, just like this ruler we're talking about, Ashur-uballit, we see Ashur show up in names from the king's list of the Assyrians frequently. Again, Ashur is considered to be a war god and oftentimes depicted as a sun god. And it's during the Middle Assyrian Empire and the rule of Ashur-uballit that the Assyrians joined the Hittites in attacking the Mitanni. Okay, particularly a Hittite king named Suppilumus. He is mentioned in connection with the Egyptians. I'll kind of go into that a little bit, but again, it's more of a story for another time. It's kind of a better story that's examined from the perspective of the Egyptians, in my opinion. But Suppilumus, king of the Hittites, is influential and does cross paths with the Assyrians. So Suppilumus forms an alliance with the Assyrians. The Assyrians and the Hittites attack the Mitanni on both sides, the Hittites from the north, the Assyrians from the south. And this is when we really start to see the earliest aggressive formations of the Assyrian Empire. And we see Ashur-uballit establish himself as a powerful and independent ruler who raises the standards of Assyrian brutality. This is where we see the Assyrians skinning people alive and accounts of that happening, the piling up of skulls of conquered peoples, and many other horrific atrocities that they were hated for in the ancient world. It's eventually this type of brutal treatment that is going to bring the people of the ancient world together against them. There are minor kings in power after Ashur-uballit from 1330 to 1308 BC. The next notable king to discuss is King Adad-nirari I. He's in power from 1308 to 1275. Okay, and there's a great battle that takes place during his after he reigns after the fact that the battle took place. So the Battle of Kadesh is what I'm talking about, and that's a place to kind of plug Super Loomis, right? Now, again, it come a point when I will do a podcast over, the 19th dynasty or the New Kingdom or both, where I talk a little bit more in detail about the Battle of Kadesh. But this is an international battle. It's dated to 1276 BC, so right at the end of the reign of Adad Nirari. And it occurs between the Hittites and Ramesses II, Pharaoh in Egypt. So both sides go home and sort of leave that area of Kadesh unprotected after they fight to a draw, right? After that, Ramesses kind of goes back home and focuses on administration and building. But the Assyrians, they start to build up their presence there, right? So the Assyrians, this undefended strip where the Egyptians and the Hittites had done battle, and northern Syria, this puts kind of opens that up to the Assyrians coming in. Okay, so Adad Nirari sweeps in and claims this area, and now the Assyrians are starting to make their presence more and more known, particularly to the culture of the Israelites, right? And we'll talk about how those cultures intersect, and that's another podcast I will definitely be doing is the Hebrew culture and their people, the United Hebrew Monarchy. It's a topic that I cover in my courses that I really enjoy teaching, and these moves that the Assyrians are making put them in the neighborhood of and just to the north of the Israelites. So the Hittites and the Egyptians are both worried about the growing presence of the Assyrians. Okay, there's a Hittite ruler named Hattushili, and Hattushili II and Ramesses II, who had previously been sort of matched against each other at Kadesh. They sort of resist the encroaching Assyrians, and a growing threat of the Assyrians starts to become sort of a prominent discussion and paranoia on everybody's mind in the region, okay? All this is sort of playing out in the reign of a ruler named Shalmaneser I. Shalmaneser is in power from 1275 to 1244 BC, and we see a tablet from his reign that is sort of a peace treaty. Okay, this occurs 4 years after Kadesh, and this tablet shows us an alliance formed between the Hittites and the Egyptians. It was discovered in 1902 and is found housed in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. After Shalmaneser I, we have a ruler named Tukulti Ninurta. He reigns from 1244 to 1208, and he is a ruler who is unable to hold on to these previous gains made by the earlier kings of Assyria. And this sends Assyria during a period of decline, which happens from 1208 to, at the end of his reign, to 911 BC. Okay, this period of Syrian decline, this is sort of an era of history that really becomes sort of a dark age, right? Nothing is really heard from the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians. Really, this whole Middle East and, Fertile Crescent area goes dark for about 250 years, okay? We do know that this is a time when the Israelites and the Hebrew people are flourishing, and one person who reigns during this time that will be same name as a later king from the Neo-Assyrian period is Tiglath-Pileser the First. He reigns from 1115 to 1077. He's the greatest Assyrian king from this era. And this is a time period which corresponds with the formation of the United Hebrew Monarchy. Okay, so this will be, again, I've mentioned this already, but this will be a podcast in and of itself. over the United Hebrew Monarchy, and I will plan on going over this topic soon, in which I'll cover Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, 12 tribes of Israel, all the way to pretty much Hezekiah's tunnel and the Babylonian captivity. So got to keep an eye out for that. It's part of the courses I teach and a part of the history I'm interested in. So I really love working with a lot of these cultures. I did a writing assignment where I wrote a large paper over placing the Israelites in Egypt when I was in my undergraduate. Okay, so it's definitely a serious interest of mine when it comes to historical topics to discuss. So the Assyrians enter a period of recovery where they start to rebound in the region, are going to form the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and this occurs from 911 to 746 BC. The Assyrians become the dominant power in the region and a force to be reckoned with for the next several hundred years, so from 911 all the way until the fall of Nineveh. It'll be until the rise of the Medes and the Chaldeans in the region and the Neo-Babylonians and of hard-fought struggles with those groups before the Assyrians are going anywhere. So by the reign of, by this period of Syrian recovery and by the reign of a guy named Adad Nerari II, the United Hebrew Monarchy had split. Adad Nerari II rules from 911 to 891 BC. And he begins this period of Assyrian recovery and starts expanding southward in Mesopotamia and into Babylon. Okay, after his reign, he's succeeded by Tekilti-Ninurta II from 891 to 884. He consolidates Assyrian gains in the region, builds Assyrian power, rebuilt the walls of the capital of Ashur, and then we have the next ruler, Ashurnazirpal II. He's in power from 884 to 859. He is a very infamously brutal ruler who tortured his enemies, started traditions of terrifying enemies into submission. He respected Babylon. He didn't really do a lot of things to damage relations with Babylon. In his reign, Ashurnazirpal does expand into northern Syria, and he also establishes some sort of peace with the Assyrians, which is probably in some form of them paying him tribute payments. We start to see that become a dominant sort of mob tactic by the Assyrians to extract tribute from conquered peoples. From 858 to 824, we have a great warrior king in this period of Assyrian recovery named Shalmaneser III. He has 31 campaigns in 35 years. He did not conquer or attack Babylon. He had campaigns in Syria in 853 BC. There's been a black obelisk discovered. It was discovered in 1846 AD. It is the earliest artifact that has a Hebrew ruler inscribed on it. This obelisk depicts the king of Israel, a guy named King Jehu, is paying tribute to Shalmaneser III. He is depicted as bowing to the Assyrian ruler in submission. So we see this sort of as a reoccurring theme when we examine the sources from this time. So there's an outbreak of civil war in Assyria during Shalmaneser III's reign. And Shalmaneser III begins to set his sights on the kingdom of Judah and Israel also during this time. After Shalmaneser III, we have another Shamshi-Adad. Okay, by this time we've got all the way to Shamshi-Adad IV. He's in power from 824 to 811, and he had to settle this problem with civil war in some of these Assyrian, like I guess you could say, colonies or subjugated areas that are rebelling. So once he gets Assyria back under control, he becomes a violent force to be reckoned with in the area. He puts down rebellions like people before him with brutal tactics. Adad Nirari the third. A lot of similar names when you look at these kings lists, right? And I'm just pulling some kings that are talked about, in different points of history that do relevant things that kind of contribute to the narrative. Again, there's over 100 kings, a lot of people to talk about, and I'm talking about maybe a dozen or so. So you have Adad Nirari the third. Okay, he is in power from 811 to 783. He takes the Assyrians to the very brink of becoming this Neo-Assyrian empire. He continues this imposition of a system of tribute on Syria, Anatolia, the Phoenicians, the Philistines, and the Israelites. All powers in the region and are all paying tribute and submitting to Adad Nirari III. Okay. Then we have Shalmaneser the fourth. Shalmaneser the fourth. He's the son of Adad Nirari. There's going to be three sons of Adad Nirari the third that we were just talking about that come in after Adad Nirari the third. Shalmaneser the fourth is one of them. He's one of the sons, and we don't know a lot about his reign other than he inherited the Assyrian Empire. Probably it's his greatest height to any date that we've talked about previously. But he's remembered as a weak ruler. The preceding violence of the Assyrians is not evident as something that he is continuing on in his reign. The second son of Adad Nirari III, very little known about him. The third son, the guy, so these are different names. The second son of Adad Nirari III is named Ashur-dayan II, 772 to 775. Again, we don't know very much about him. Now, the third son of Adad Nirari III, he is the third ruler we don't know a whole lot about in this line, right? And he is killed in a palace revolution in 745 BC. And this is what really shifts the tides in bringing about the formation of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Okay, so I'm going to start off kind of talking about the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This will be like our last major topic of history to get into. This lasts from 745 BC to 612 BC. And it's during this time, a little earlier actually, and ends a little bit before the Neo-Assyrians end, that we see the rise of a Nubian dynasty in Egypt. Okay, this is the 25th dynasty. And it begins to form just a little bit before the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This is when the political kingdom of Kush is founded between the Nubians and the Kushites. Nubia had been treated previously as sort of an Egyptian colony. There were two temples to Amun that were built close to the Fourth Cataract. One was built by Tutmosis III, the other had been built by Ramesses II. These priests of Amun are very powerful here at this location of the Fourth Cataract. There's a sacred mountain called Jebel Barkal, Barkal. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And eventually, these Nubian chieftains realized that they could form an alliance with the chiefs of Amun and establish political dominance. So the capital of Kush is established at Miro on the Fourth Cataract. This town has about 25,000 citizens. It's a very industrialized city. There's more iron ore deposits here than all the rest of Africa, and they spun and wove more cotton cloth, which is very high demand for the priests of Amun. They were producing more cloth than anyone else in the region at this time. Also, another thing is there's more pyramids at Miro than all of the rest of Egypt, but they're much smaller. They're steeper, but they have steeper angles